I'm Charles Elwonger. Charles, could you speak up a little bit more?
So yeah, my name's Charles Elwonger. I put out games under this name and with a also sometimes collaborative. Jocelyn Reyes is here, usually does the sound for the game. And if you've played Lost in the Woods so far, you might know there's maybe a 50% chance you got a little bit out of date build, so you might have fallen through the floor, seen some crazy stuff in the sky.
That's a fantastic arcade tradition.
Yes, that is because the fantastic arcade people are such supreme badasses that they let us in the build the morning of the festival, and so I'll try to make sure it all got propagated, but I'll walk through it here so you don't even have to experience it for yourself. So I'll just start off here. So this is a game about some accidental discovery that you find while hacking out in the woods. And as you go through the game, through a chance occurrence, you happen to uncover an initial clue that sets you out, that gives you some reference that you understand how to interpret some other monuments and artifacts that you find out of the woods. And you start to piece together the backstory of who used to live there and what they were doing. And the level right here is kind of a demo level. It was just a small snippet of the game. It's just during the nighttime. There's a lot of themes of astronomy in the game. And so you can, in this portion of the game, you can walk through and it allows you to kind of sit down and get a little bit of a time-lapse view of the sky to identify the North Star, not using North Star either, but navigate through the environment. And so the game itself is really kind of a narrative-focused thing. I've taken a kind of user experience design breakdown of great, just basic interaction mechanics to communicate the impression, the feeling, the discovery. And the game is designed around creating a particular challenge for the player. There's no obstacles you necessarily have to overcome. Nothing that's too challenging. It's more about just instilling that sensation of discovery. And so you as a player understand why you're the first person to find the story of these people. Yes, and some of this user interface design, like you saw in the menu there, kind of drawn off of a lot of the design on state park signs that I really like. For one, it seems very directly related to the fact that you're walking around in the woods. And it also kind of suggests the fact that there's some free-form exploration because there's a lot of paths the game suggests you to follow. So that if you want, you can just wander around and enjoy the scenery, but for reaching those important parts, there's always kind of a curated path to go. And just walk through a little bit. This is just the demo level here. So it's easy to get lost when you're walking through the ground. You can always look up, try to find that North Star again.
It was a little hard to hear you when you mentioned it, but you're the first developer we've had up here to talk specifically about interface design. Do you have like a background in UI design, or how did you come to games?
So that's actually kind of a two-pronged question because I've always felt like I've had I guess 2 careers going simultaneously in a way. My day job is actually doing software design for a design agency here in town. I've worked for a couple of agencies over the past 4 or 5 years, and that's been fun. It's been very rewarding because in those agencies we do a lot of design research, which just means that we interview people and talk to people a lot about how they interact with their software on a day-to-day basis. And there's a lot of very interesting refined design processes that are in place in the industry that it gives me a lot of work from the game design. So it's I can actually bring up an example of that here with some photos. Basically, the kind of user experience design process I'm working with is you kind of start just by brainstorming and writing everything down and putting out little post-it. I like to work with post-it notes and stuff because it's easy to rearrange them. So this is an example of how I kind of wrote down, for one, different color-coded things of blue or specific events or items that happen in the game, or different ideas and themes we're going to talk about. And you can go through scene by scene and kind of lay out what happens when, basically build kind of interactive flow chart. And that's something that led me to storyboarding, which was pretty rewarding. And also some of the design process includes some clay modeling.
You're the first person I've seen that does Play-Doh design mock-ups. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's fun. You can imagine yourself as a little miniature Play-Doh person walking around through this landscape.
It kind of makes sense though, because it's a 3D game. Like you're thinking.
Yeah, I've actually, for environments that have actual buildings and 90-degree angles, I've used Legos in the past. For this game, because it was all organic, I went out and lots of this dough to sculpt with. Another thing I like is the fact that it's totally impermanent, it never hardens. So you have to just get your ideas out there fast, and it encourages me to kind of work through, shift it, and never necessarily settle on one thing until it's really the right thing, and then get rid of it.
And if you get frustrated, you can just Hulk smash the entire game.
Yes. Or I can beat to my dog. I'm really angry about it. So that's kind of the design process that went into specifically this game I created here for the Master Arcade. And it's fun. I'll load up. There is a whole daytime portion of the game, which is not on display here because a lot of the code is pretty janky. But I will walk through it right now.
Janky code is our middle name. Right?
Yeah, that's what I specialize in. So that's my root match. So the game actually starts off during the daytime, during the little hiking trip, and we'll walk through the woods, normal bridge.
I think one of the most striking things about this game, obviously, is the crazy color palette that you use. It's super beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about the use of color?
Yeah, I would love to. So the colors in the game, actually how I arrived on the initial color palette was kind of a funny story. I created a previous game, which was my first Unity game called Morning Coffee, and the outside, if you look, the inside of the game was all very yellow and warm, and the outside was purple and green gradients. And I thought, well, this is an outside game. I'm just going to take the color palette from this game and just go outside. And that was the initial. That's where I at least arrived at purple and green. And as far as developing that further, what I really liked about this it really played off of the simplistic art style. Working alone with to create all this 3D art, obviously I don't have a lot of time to be able to realistically render an entire forest. And so using a lot of flat colors and gradients and fog has given me a really good way to basically communicate and create the impression that you're in a very heavily foliaged area that's actively blocking your view without actually having to leaves in front of you or anything. Here's my.
It's almost like there's a real world out there that you're in, but you're walking through sort of a map representation of it.
Yeah, that's a good way to break it down. I'm trying to create this stylized rendition of the idea. So it almost, in my mind, I'm almost thinking it's like a memory of a journey you're walking through. So it's not the immersive impression of being there, but more of the more contemplative impression of going back through this experience in your mind. So the game actually will start off with a lot of, some spatial reasoning and wayfinding will be important. You go here, we'll end up finding a map, and we can do a little bit of a running.
Do that again? That's awesome.
And so then you get this map that just really lays out some of the key landmarks of the environment. And you can never get too lost yourself. The title doesn't necessarily refer to you being lost in the woods. It's more about where you're finding who was lost in the woods. So the game isn't about you being lost, but the map here will help you find out what is out there to discover. And as far as interaction basis, I've been trying to keep it simple. The whole game, I'm trying to make it basically one mouse and really trying to leverage a lot of expression achieved through a single click and mouse movement, and then with the right click, to bring everything in the map. I grew up playing a lot of first-person shooters, but also a lot of games like this and stuff like that. And when it came to making a first-person game, I thought I just really like that simplicity of anyone can jump on and point and click. And it really allowed me to focus on the more interesting aspects instead of thinking about how players strategically going to maneuver through something. They can just point and click, but it still has something like animation. So, starting to walk through here, discover our first monument. Seeing it from one side. You can check out these beautiful climbing animations. You're not playing a superhero that can fly.
I don't know, he's a pretty decent climber. I didn't even really struggle there.
It's a metaphor, man. And so now that we're on a vantage point, some of the fog clears up, and you kind of get to see where you came from. You can't quite see where you're going, but you can see the next step. And that's kind of the design process that I'm going through in the environment. You're kind of building a mental map of your environment. You're walking through, and piece by piece, getting a view of one new thing at a time whenever possible, and then getting to recontextualize it with a view of where you just came from. And so now we can see this weird thing here, which corresponds to the circles on the map. So we're starting to discover where we're headed. And so the idea of the backstory, I won't get too much into spoilers of the backstory, but suffice it to say, it's about some people during the, pre-Galilean astronomers who were not able to really practice a lot of their research based on various forms of societal and cultural pressures at the time. So they had to kind of come out to the woods, and you're now finally, you're doing a little bit of archaeological storytelling in the sense of traditional environmental story things where you're walking through and you're finding clues of a story that already happened, but I'm trying to resolve that a little bit and make the player a part of the story because it's kind of up to you to continue the story. Right now, everything they found, everything that exists is out, just lost in the woods, and you need to, I shouldn't say you need to, but hopefully you opt to continue their story by finding out what happened. So, so that's a demo walkthrough. I guess I can talk about some other design elements, or does anyone have any questions right now?
Just a moment. Hello. You've made a very meditative experience. Do you imagine the player sort of experiencing it beginning to end in a single play session, or is it divided into kind of discrete areas?
That's a really good question. I am currently balancing discovering what the exact length of the game will be, and that's informing my decision. I definitely have one specific breakpoint in the game where you find particular pieces of evidence where it changes, the storyline changes from you finding evidence of what happened in the story, but then you kind of finally get that kind of climactic revelation that from then on it's kind of up for you to choose where to go. And at that moment, that'll be when it transitions from day to night, and that'll be when you actually transition from a stylized non-diegetic UI like this to a more diegetic UI where you're actually handling physical objects. So there will actually be one specific breakpoint in the game like that, and if it goes longer, I'm thinking about finding other breakpoints and maybe an interesting way of exposing that in the game. So maybe there's sort of chapter ends and you go and you camp out for the next. I like the games that give you a stopping point if it's long enough. It's like, you can stop and save your game and come back to it later. You don't have to feel like you have to keep going and pushing on because
I kind of like the way like Sword and Sorcery is like, no, stop playing.
Yes, that was great. I
can't play anymore.
The first time I played it, I thought, oh great, cool, I'm going to go to sleep now. This is nice. Because I'm playing it at night.
Come back next week.
Yeah, and actually it's funny, I think Mirror's Edge and Halo both do that really well. I guess if you were playing through in the game, you wouldn't necessarily realize scenes, like it just continues on, but when you come back, everything's divided up into chapters and inner checkpoints. And so it's really easy to, almost like if you're thumbing through a book, you kind of know how far you are. I've also talked a little bit about actually, if you get to a checkpoint like that, actually displaying a little UI graph on the side, like when you're reading an ebook and it shows how far you've been through the book.
That's pretty cool. I think Earthbound also guilted you into stopping. It was like, you've really been playing for a long time. You should stop or do your homework.
Yeah. There was, I don't know if anyone's seen the special ending of the Jurassic Park video game, but if you take your time to get all of the collectibles, whatever the collectible was, and after the end credits you get a special video outside, get on, have a life.
Any other questions for Charles? So
Morning Coffee was your previous game. Is that in the same universe as this game?
Sorry?
Is Morning Coffee in the same universe as Lost in the Woods?
That could very well be the case. I've kind of imagined it happening in the real world, so I guess technically it could be. But this is a little bit of an alternate history, so I'm going to go with yes. Now I'll have to find a way to tie that together within the game.
Thank you. I'm still really stoked about getting you up here, getting a UI designer who's working in games up here. I think it's really telling that the kind of more somebody really puts thought into the user interface of the game, the less UI there actually kind of is. Like, this is a very clean, there's not a lot of interface elements, it's all very clean. What is there, it's very kind of transparent. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, and it's been a really fun process to get to that, because it came from a place of, like I showed the photos of, really just building it up. One, to be economical, and two, to just be kind of pure for the experience of building up what has to be in the game. There's a lot of designers that are being credited saying things like as little design as possible, or design is reducing it to the smallest thing that can be. And I think that's also given me a lot of chance to express various ideas.
The funny thing is, like, you see software designers pick up that and be like, oh yeah, obviously, like, we want to design in this sort of simplistic way, but without coupling and stuff. But a lot of times they ignore the UI, especially games, ignore the sort of UI version of that, and you end up with games that are like or Fortress is one of the most incredible simulations that's ever been in a game, but you have to do your fucking taxes to play it, basically. It's like 10 million menus of just stuff that you get lost in. So I think a lot of people don't realize that, like, sometimes the game creation process is like a process of actually eliminating things.
Yeah, and I think something of that too is that game design and user interface design have historically been treated by a lot of people as two very different professions. When really it's really the same thing. It just depends on what you want to focus on. Where, say, someone in software would call themselves a user experience designer that is in charge of making the apps on your phone function well. Well, as a game designer, you're also really doing the same thing, but the experience you're designing is game. And if you can take that holistic approach to designing the video game and making the video game or the UI an intrinsic part of it, it just all falls into place together.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, doing UI for games is almost like the fine art version of doing UI for like a business application. Because in a game, you don't have to be a slave to, making frictionless surfaces for people to just easily do stuff. You can actually challenge a user on purpose. That's a thing you could never do in a business application.
Yeah, that's very true. And especially business applications are all optimized towards using established patterns, so they're really easy to use. And in the game, you can challenge people, like you said, or just for pure novelty purposes. You can make things work differently as long as it's clear enough, as clear as you want it to be. It doesn't have to be that clear if it's supposed to be more of an investigative experience. But you have the opportunity to do something that works well, but no one's really ever interacted with it before, so you have more free reign.
Yeah, definitely, like, teaching a player a novel interaction is like kind of the joy of, I mean, on both sides. Like, it feels good when you master a new thing. It also feels good to be able to do something that's really experimental and not be always a slave to using familiar patterns. Do you have any more questions for Charles about Lost in the Woods or life in general? You want to do a little bit more playthrough? How are you feeling?
I could pretty much play through everything I have in the show to build right now.
All right. Well, we won't spoil the surprise. Check out the game on the laptop. It's called, what's up?
Oh, shit.
Hi. So when I played the demo so far, it seemed to me like verticality is really important to this game. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Oh yeah. So
First off, explain what you guys mean by verticality.
You can explain it. Sure.
No. Yeah, you can.
Well, I guess like the last 20 years of video games and 3D space at least have been very flat. Everything is very like on one level.
So he literally means verticality. There's a lot of climbing in the game.
Yeah. So vertical space has always been, I think, climbing in a first-person game is probably my favorite thing to do in a first-person game. If I'm playing one, I will climb to every rooftop I can get to, possibly, even if it means splitting butts. So I just think what I visually like to do is something that kind of naturally found its way into the equation, but it's also very important to the story. So I'm glad you asked this because I skipped this point. So the first half of the game, which is taking place during the daytime, it's mostly about just finding your way through the space and finding some of the artifacts. And then once you get some of the greater knowledge in that mid-break point of the game, you start to realize more accurately what each piece means. And so there's a transition point where you're realizing a lot of this stuff is centered around astronomy and star observation. And then at nighttime, the way you find your way around the environment is through referencing the stars in the sky. And so I'm trying to build the scaffolding in the first part of understanding the 3D space in your head, and then at night rolling that out even further so you start to understand how the section of the world that you're in relates to the stars in the sky, and how they'll change position over time at night, and how that affects the alignment. And to use that vertical space and keep people looking up in the sky to kind of reiterate, I guess, what our literal physical space is in the solar system.
That was intense. Do we have any additional Questions for Charles? All right, well, make sure and check out his game on the laptops. It's called Lost in the Woods. It's super cool. And everybody give Charles a round of applause. Thank you. All right. I'd like to take a quick second to thank our sponsors.